Thank you. Hopefully everybody is refreshed from the break. We'll kick off a little bit earlier and everything to give more networking and drinking time at the end, if that is the way you want to go in that direction anyway. What we've done the last few years as part of this event, which has become an annual thing, which is really cool, is have personal testimony. And we've had people speak who are directly involved in the aerospace and aviation industry. And the plan this year was to do something slightly different. So I reached out internally to the Pride and Allies group, and also within Frazer-Nash Consultancy, where I work as a senior business manager, to get a different perspective, to show how things are different in different industries, but I'm sure in some instances are actually the same as well, in terms of how it is to work and live as an LGBTQ plus person in a particular industry. So I was really pleased when my colleague Keir volunteered to come and speak. He is not in the aerospace industry, and that's not his fault. Okay, it's other industries are allowed to exist and are just as important and valued. But Keir is an excellent speaker and orator. He's got a real way with words that I'm quite jealous of, really, and he's writes some really considered pieces internally. I've known him for many years, and I've interacted with him mostly because he was one of the founders of Frazer-Nash's internal Pride and Allies group that was started and then turned into the biggest and most powerful of all. It was the first one, though, and it's still the biggest ERG internally, and became the model for how Frazer-Nash has really embraced equity, diversity and inclusion across loads of different characteristics. I'll see if I can list all our ERGs, and I'll forget at least one or two, but Pride and Allies came first, then there was gender equity, I think, second, the race equity and allyship group, then the neurodiversity and Frazer-Nash group, there's the veterans and reservists and allies group. What am I missing? The disabilities group is the most recent one. And I've made it like a personal thing that I'm in every ally, in every ERG as an ally, except the veterans one, where I am a veteran, so I get to just be in there and be an ally to my fellow veterans and the reservists that are in there and everything. But Keir is an excellent ally. He's a good friend of mine, and I'm very privileged to invite him up to speak to you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Luke. That's very kind of you. And I'm looking around at all these photos of me. It does feel a little bit like my mum's house, just because that's the only other place where I know there's that many. But good afternoon, everybody. And before I start, thank you to all the previous speakers, because you've unknowingly really set the tone really well for some of the things that I'm going to cover in what I'm going to say today. So some of the topics that you've spoken about, and we've never met before today, by the way, so it's very serendipitous. But thank you for that, because you've really helped me with this one. So good afternoon. First, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks for inviting me to be part of the Royal Aeronautical Society's celebration today for International Day of LGBTQ plus people in STEM. It's an honour to share my story with such a distinguished group, and I'd like to thank my colleagues Luke and Cass for putting me forward to speak today. I'm Keir, he, him pronouns. I'm a naval architect and a marine engineer, currently the commercial marine business manager at Frazer-Nash Consultancy. But don't worry, this is not going to be a talk about how my adversity has improved my business sales. I'll save that for a LinkedIn post later on. So when coming to write this speech, I must admit I found it quite challenging, as there have been so many experiences over many years, and narrowing them down to 20 minutes wasn't easy. But to help myself, I decided to explore the intersections of our professional lives, not just between maritime and aerospace, but also where our authentic selves meet our work identities. It's a story that journeys across oceans, through engineering challenges, and to the heart of what it means to be a diverse community in STEM. It involves a lot of learning, some awkward moments, and a fair amount of resilience building. Maybe it's a familiar story to some of you in this room today. I suspect it probably is. Or maybe you know someone with similar experiences. But the aim of today is not to elicit sympathy or pity. Many people go through their lives with all kinds of challenges, many much worse than I've experienced, that shape who they are. And when I say that, I also do so with the understanding that there are many aspects to me that give me some privileges and advantages that others do not have. The main aim of today is empathy. That's a topic we've discussed today already. To understand someone else's perspective and how their experiences influence their view of the world and their reactions to it. It's a story that has shaped who I am and has ultimately led me here to talk to you today. So, to kick things off, let's talk about some heritage. Maritime life goes quite far back in my family, with a litany of nautical tales, including Captain John Gravel, who famously got stuck in Arctic ice for 6 months in 1866 aboard his ship, the Diana. You can read his story in the Hull Maritime Museum. Sometime later, my great-grandpa, he served on HMS Ark Royal as a Royal Marine during World War II. And more recently, my dad and uncle started their lives braving the North Sea as fishermen when they were teenagers. So you might say that I was destined to find my sea legs at some point. But for me, destiny started in the departure lounge at Leeds Bradford Airport at the age of 21. Setting off across the world, ultimately becoming very jet-lagged and bleary-eyed, staring up at my first ship in South Korea after a 36-hour odyssey from the UK. At that moment, standing next to the ship, which was called the Gosport Maersk, a big container ship, its sheer size seemed overwhelming. Yet amid thoughts of, what on earth am I doing here, one thing I didn't focus on right away was how being gay might shape my experience at sea. Why? Well, at this stage, I was already an expert at compartmentalizing, and I knew how to get by in environments where being different could make you stand out in ways you'd rather not. I'd had many tough years of school to teach me that. So I packaged it all away to deal with once I'd found my bearings aboard my home for the next few months. Life at sea feels like being a self-contained world where the ship becomes its own interconnected community. Privacy is scarce and people are unavoidable. And as a cadet, I was determined to get on with everyone on board, as I wanted my time to go as smoothly as possible, as you probably expect on your first time at sea. So I kept my head down. I focused on the technical aspects of my job and work, looking at ship systems, operations and procedures, and making sure that I performed the tasks expected of me during my training. To be honest, a lot of daily life was fun, fixing systems and equipment and getting to know the ship inside and out. There were also adventures to be had in various ports that we called out around the world, from the Far East to Eastern Europe and South America. Life was far from boring and uneventful, but there was another, more secretive side to me, working hard to stay invisible. I created a persona that I thought would keep me safe. There were rules to maintaining this persona, of course, no more than having a couple of pints at the pub if we went there, to avoid slip-ups, no sharing of personal details, and definitely no talks about relationships. It was exhausting. Sure, I got along with my crewmates, but they never truly knew me, because how could they? I wasn't even showing up as myself. And let's not forget the added complexity of working in a multinational environment. On board, I shared space with people from South Africa, Poland, Romania, the Philippines, Thailand, and many other places. Each culture brought a unique dynamic, and navigating these differences added even more layers of complexity. I barely knew how people who I grew up with would react, so definitely didn't know how people from thousands of miles away would react. When you're already hiding a part of yourself, that kind of diplomacy adds a whole new layer of stress. There's something profoundly ironic about feeling confined in the middle of a vast ocean. Outwardly, I was thriving, but inwardly, I felt isolated and lonely. I listened as crewmates shared stories about their families and partners, wishing I could do the same. But instead, I'd nod along, offering neutral smiles and vague anecdotes, careful not to give the game away. Isolation wasn't just emotional either. Actual communication off the ship was physically limited, with only one daily email burst. So if I wanted to stay connected with loved ones, I could only do it very infrequently. My world felt incredibly small, and there was no support network. If I did manage to get mobile signal, I went to isolated parts of the ship to make calls home to my partner, hoping that nobody could hear me and the conversations I was having. And yet, in these quiet moments at sea, I also had time to reflect. I began to understand how much energy I wasted on hiding. Longing to be genuine wasn't just about getting by, it was about finding a way to thrive. Looking back, I realized that those first experiences made me more resilient, and they also helped me to understand the importance of representation and allyship in STEM fields, especially, but not exclusively, in maritime. When we talk about mental health at sea today, it is precisely these things that form part of the complex house of cards that can be someone's mental state. And one thing that's taught me in my early career is that it is one thing to talk about inclusivity from the safety of an office where things are often vastly better. It's another thing to live through the reality in environments where you are on your own, whether that be at sea, in the air, close to home, or far away. However, being at sea was only the start of my STEM journey. After graduating from university, I started my first graduate job as a naval architect in a shipyard in Scotland. Like ships, shipyards are equally fascinating and exciting places and heavily rooted in tradition. And like ships, shipyards are still places where there is a very masculine workforce, being predominantly made up of men, although this is changing slowly. Much like my time at sea, the shipyard was its own insular world. There was a sense of community, of course, but also an adherence to tradition. And once again, I found myself playing a familiar game, blending in. After a few years of practice at sea, I'd become really good at this now. I nodded along during tea breaks, and laughed at jokes, and even the homophobic ones that made me wince inside, and stayed safely neutral when conversations veered towards anything that could give the game away. It was a script I knew well, and I delivered my lines flawlessly. But the thing about isolation is that it can be very obvious. Even amid the business of a shipyard, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was just hiding in plain sight. I craved genuine connection with my peers, and the cost of authenticity still felt too high. So again, I kept my head down, immersing myself in the technical challenges, all while yearning for a space where I didn't have to pretend. But this time, working ashore instead of at sea had its advantages. My time was my time. I could make friends outside of work and develop social circles with people who were like me. And I did this with enthusiasm. The duality between my genuine self and the persona I created was even more pronounced now. I had two lives, one completely fake and the other genuine, and it switched as I clocked in and out of work. However, despite still acting at work, having a life on the outside started me on a path to being more confident in myself, knowing that I finally had the access to a support network of friends nearby. I was no longer isolated and alone. I felt the light at the end of the tunnel first appeared when I transferred away from shipyards into marine consultancy. Gone were the steel toe-cap boots and hard hats, replaced by office chairs, coffee and desks. The work was no less demanding, but the environment was different, and it made a world of difference. At first, I carried the usual mindset with me, sticking to safe topics and dodging personal questions, but the culture of the office was much different, and the warmth and openness that I hadn't encountered before was present. Slowly, I began to let my guard down. Conversations moved beyond the professional, and I found myself testing the boundaries of what I could share. Then came a pivotal moment. I was sat in a car with a more senior engineer, just chatting on the return from a meeting, probably stuck in traffic. It was a sunny afternoon on the M5, and whilst we were there, my colleague asked me whether I had a girlfriend. It was completely out of the blue, and I hadn't anticipated it. And in that moment, I just thought to myself, just do it. So I did, and out of my mouth, I actually said the words, actually, I have a boyfriend. And just like that, the world kept on turning. There was no long silence, no raised eyebrows, maybe a slightly awkward apology and saying I didn't realise. But, I wasn't expecting an EastEnders-style drama, but conversely, I didn't realise it would actually be such an anticlimax either. I felt lucky, and it really boosted my self-confidence. From that point on, the persona I'd used at work for years fell away, replaced by a sense of freedom that I'd never known before. No more editing conversations or in real time or worrying about slipping up. I was finally able to show up for myself the majority of the time. This sense of relief was profound, and being honest about who I was didn't just improve my mental health, it changed how I connected with my colleagues. Relationships became much more genuine. I found allies, friends, and a support system that celebrated my authenticity. And in the process, I discovered that bringing my whole self to work maybe better at my job. I was more engaged, more creative, and more willing to take risks because I wasn't wasting energy on creating a fiction about myself. But life's course is rarely linear, and being the apparent glutton for punishment that I can be, I decided to take a leap and took a job as a salvage naval architect and marine surveyor in Singapore. I'd never let my apprehension about being genuine get in the way of a fun opportunity before, and I wasn't going to start now. Now, for those that don't know much about Singapore, the city-state in Southeast Asia is one of the world's biggest maritime hubs. Landing at Changi Airport, you can't help but notice the hundreds of ships anchored in the Singapore Strait. The view is very impressive, and many of you are probably aware of the futuristic look of the Singapore cityscape. But beneath the stunning skyline lies a complex social landscape for LGBTQ individuals. Singapore at the time was a place of contradictions. On one hand, it was an incredibly dynamic environment for my career, fast-paced, globally connected and rewarding projects, giving me the opportunity to travel all over Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, I had the privilege of meeting LGBTQ plus Singaporeans who showed me their experience of the legal and cultural realities and layers of personal risk and restraint. Section 377A, the law that criminalised same-sex relationships between men, wasn't just a law, it was a symbol of a societal attitude that was made being open about personal identity very difficult. I really enjoyed the work I did in Singapore. Some of my most enjoyable times I've had have been whilst crawling around ships in various, often remote parts of the world. I spent 10 days in Taiwan doing sonar surveys on a wreck that sunk during a typhoon. I travelled to places like Myanmar and the Philippines to do surveys on damaged ship in remote locations. And one of my last projects there was overseeing oil removal from a sunken ship in the Singapore Strait. Life working at sea and working abroad offered a perspective that I would not have received had I decided not to go. I did work that was fulfilling, exciting, and a lot of fun. But while the work pushed me to new professional heights, the constant need for discretion, the careful calculations about who to trust, and the fear of consequences beyond just career setbacks added an emotional toll. Professionally, working abroad was a boost, but personally, it was a step back in the closet. Whilst I had 3 incredible years in Singapore, it was a reminder that even in environments of professional success, personal authenticity can feel like an unaffordable luxury. Yet those experiences shaped my resolve. It confirmed to me that you can manage the tension between personal authenticity and professional experience in your career. And these experiences highlighted how critical it is for industries to foster not only technical innovation, but also inclusivity, ensuring that every individual, regardless of their background or identity, can thrive. The maritime and aerospace industry's strengths lie in its diversity, drawing talent from across the world and gaining new experiences and different ways of thinking. But to truly capitalise on that strength, we must ensure that no one is forced to navigate their career alone, burdened by an overwhelming fear of rejection or reprisal. Since returning to the UK 7 years ago, the experiences I've gathered from working at sea, in shipyards, and overseas have profoundly shaped my perspective on what it means to be authentic at work. Each of those environments tested me in unique ways, and together they fueled a determination to make a difference, not just for myself, but for others who might be navigating similar challenges. Maritime, much like the rest of STEM, hasn't historically been a place where LGBTQ plus people have role models that are visible. For much of my career, I could count on one hand the number of people that I knew in the industry who were like me, and that isolation drove me to want to change the narrative. I didn't want the next generation of engineers to come into an industry believing they had to choose between their careers and being themselves. And unlike my early days as a nervous cadet, upon my return home, I had now got the experiences and confidence to act. I connected with like-minded professionals through networks like Inter-Engineering, which was mentioned earlier on, and I found allies in companies like Babcock and Airbus, where LGBTQ plus employee groups were already thriving. Their advice was invaluable as I started similar activities in Frazer-Nash. And this began with some small steps, organising a World AIDS Day collection in 2019, and that grew into something far larger. In early 2020, I wrote Frazer-Nash's first article for the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. This turned out to be a watershed moment for Frazer-Nash's journey into promoting inclusivity. People who had felt isolated themselves, thinking they were the only LGBTQ plus person in the company, began reaching out. What sticks in my mind specifically was my colleague Peter, now chair of our Pride and Allies group, who admitted, "I thought it was just me and didn't realise that there are other people like him in the company." And I still have that email that I actually kept, that he sent to me after the article was written and went online. And this single act birthed an employee group that now has around 80 members today from all over the company. It turned out that there are many more of us in the company than I realised, and publishing that article was enough for them to reach out and make contact, each thinking that they were the only one LGBTQ plus person in the business. We are far from alone. Beyond Frazer-Nash, I have the privilege of serving as a trustee for I Exist Too, a charity advocating for LGBTQ plus seafarers worldwide. Together, we've built partnerships with other organisations, hosted international conferences, and even brought our message to the UN's maritime body, the International Maritime Organization. None of this has been a solo effort. It is the power of community and action. People who once felt alone came together and, in doing so, created real change. Now, fast forwarding to today, and I barely recognise that 21-year-old cadet. As you can see, there's a few more greys in the hair than there were before, so quite a few years has passed. When I finally met others who were open, thriving, and unapologetically themselves, it gave me courage to do the same. There's no doubt that LGBTQ plus representation and visibility in the UK generally has improved over the last few decades. However, in STEM, we still suffer from a lack of visible role models. Visibility and representation continue to be important aspects of the work that needs to be done. Being at a company like Frazer-Nash, I've had the chance to work with others to create something better for those who come after me. But let's be clear, this is not just my journey. There are many whose challenges are greater. Women, people of colour, or those navigating multiple intersections of identity. And to that end, I recognise in myself and in my story today that whilst it shares an important perspective, there are many advantages and privileges I have being born a man who is white, and that others face challenges that I can only understand by listening. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of empathy and understanding. And as my mum likes to say, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because listening is twice as important as speaking. And I realise the irony of saying that whilst I'm giving a speech. By sharing our stories and listening to others, we foster a culture where inclusivity isn't a zero-sum game, where everyone is free to bring their whole selves to work, and the entire team and the entire industry benefits. If my story helps even one person feel less alone and inspires them to take that first step towards authenticity, then I've done what I set out to do. Because in the end, it's not just about navigating your own course, it's about charting a path that others can follow. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you might have. And I can't actually see at the moment because it's quite dark, so if anyone does have their hand up, just that's better, thank you. Any questions at all? Go for it, Luke.
Thanks, Keir. That was every bit as inspiring as I knew it would be, so thank you so much. So, from your perspective as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, our company is different than when you joined and when I joined 10 years ago, and society is definitely changing. You mentioned that the energy of having to hide your true self impacted your ability to do your job as well as you perhaps could have done it and everything. Yeah. Have you had people reach out to you as somebody who's sort of out and open and everything about still having to do that, and what sort of advice do you give to people about being authentic at the start of their career maybe?
I think nowadays it's slightly different. As we said earlier on in some of the other presentations, there's almost an expectation now that when people are looking for jobs, they look for places where they can feel comfortable. And so people will often go on company websites looking for pride groups, for example, etc., depending on what particular area they're looking for. So I think now there's almost an expectation on companies, if they want to recruit people, talented people into your business, then you've got to show that it is a safe space to work. But when I was going into industry, that wasn't there. So you kind of just had to, you just had to go for it and just hope that you weren't going to have any problems. And it's really nice to see that now that it's kind of flipped the other way around. We are having to show people that we are a good place to work. And by doing so, we do that by showing that we've got ERGs, such as the Pride and Allies group, for example. So that's one big change that I can see that's really positively affected. In terms of whether someone's come to me and that's not their authentic selves, no one's specifically done that yet. However, if they were to, I would say to them, I would point them in the direction, hey, they've obviously confided in me, so they're aware of me as someone to talk to, but also signposting them to the Pride and Allies group or whatever group it is that they need to help them, really, would be the best way to do it, I think. Signposting can be quite powerful if you're not entirely sure how to address it directly yourself.
Hello, thank you for the speech. It was fantastic. It was really interesting to sort of hear your journey go through it all. My question is, just out of interest, pure interest, the maritime industry now and life aboard ships, is it a lot different in terms of LGBTQ plus lives at sea, or is it much like it was when you first joined?
It's a difficult question. The reason it's a difficult question is because has the industry, has it got better? It's hard to say, because as I've gone through my career, I've met more people. So is it just because I've met more people that are in a similar situation to me, or has it generally got better? And I think it's a mixture of both. Obviously, through the organisations that I work with, I've met lots of people who have a very similar background to me, former seafarers that have been working at sea or worked in the maritime industry. And obviously, we've all come together to create I Exist Too to help with sort of seafarer rights, LGBT seafarer rights at sea as well. So from the way I see it, because these organisations exist, it's got better. Whether it's actually gotten better from the seafarer's perspective, I'm unsure, because those data aren't available at the moment, and that's something that we want to look at. Because people don't necessarily want to contribute that, because the worry is that they outed themselves by doing so. Because the problem is, unlike lots of other industries, maritime is very isolating, because on a ship on your own, there's no way you can really communicate externally from that ship. So it can be very difficult to get that information. Gut feel, if I'm honest, I think it has got better. And it's not just because of LGBT representation. It's also because of the fact that you've got many more women working in the industry now. And I think they kind of, equality and diversity across many groups kind of grows at the same time. So you've got, with more women in the industry, you're probably going to have more LGBT people in the industry, just because of the two go hand in hand, really. So that's what I suspect has happened, but I can't confirm that, unfortunately.
Hi, thanks for that. Just want to, I'm going to say the question to you, but really it is to you and anyone else who's presented today and who's a business leader in this room who can have any influence, I guess. So you've talked about, being on a ship, but people coming from all over the world on that ship.
Yeah.
And then you've talked about, the workplaces that are more safe spaces, I guess, for more people, more diverse groups of people are going to attract those people.
Yeah.
But we're in a world now that is lunging, at least with political ideology, to the far right. So all of you that are doing these ERGs and, or have a stake in sort of any sort of diversity or inclusion in your workplace, or even at a business level, what role can you guys play, or can we play as a society, I guess, in making sure companies code that in? Because we're seeing companies like Toyota completely scrap any D&I investment, and we've had the recent US election. It doesn't take long for certain ideologies to start being discussed over here. Abortion rights being one of them. That's it started raising its head here since. So what are you guys able to do? And maybe is that transition from an ERG to the BRG to make sure your company's code in this practice? Because it's okay now when it's an ERG and it's kind of like a non-operational funding, as it was said before. What happens if people or political influence starts forcing a shift? I know it's quite a broad question,
No, that's fine.
but I think it's a question for you and then the room.
I think the difference nowadays compared to the past is the fact that we are now aware of each other nowadays. So whereas before, one of the problems we had was isolation. We didn't know each other existed, really. Now we're very much aware that other people in our respective companies and industries exist. And you can't stop those people from working together, talking and organising things together. And that's a real strength of ERGs, of industry groups, of organisations that promote inclusivity and diversity. And trying to put, even if you closed it, say if hypothetically a company did close down groups or whatever, even if they did that, the people still exist, they're still there, and they're not changing themselves, and they can still talk and organise and organise themselves. And trying to put that back in a box can be very difficult. So what gives me optimism, despite the kind of geopolitical gloom, is the fact that there is a greater awareness now, both in the public and between ourselves, of who's who, where we are, how many of us there are. And I think that's a power that we're going to have to lean on. Also, the importance of allyship as well. We spoke about allyship earlier on. That has now become much more concrete than it was in the past as something to be aware of, and that's going to be important. It doesn't matter what ERG you're going to be in. We're going to have to rely on allies even more to keep going in the worst case scenario of whatever happens politically. So it gives me pause for thought and makes me we've got to be careful, but also I'm optimistic that we do have a strong foundation now from which to work, and I don't think any of us are going to be going back in the closet anytime soon. So I think that's very. Hopefully that's answered a bit of your question, but a little bit further. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards as well, if I can think of something more profound to say. Well, thank you very much.